Through the blinding snow, she stood trembling. A pregnant German shepherd, chained and beaten, her breath fogging in the bitter Montana night. She had no name then, only pain, until a deputy named Mark Lawson drove into the storm and saw the truth no one else dared to face. What began as one man's instinct to save a wounded animal would unravel into a fight against a criminal empire, a battle for justice, and the rebirth of hope itself. You'll witness how betrayal, sacrifice, and the courage of a single dog carried an entire town from despair to redemption. This isn't just a tale about cruelty. It's about how God places miracles in our path, sometimes with 4 paws and eyes that refuse to surrender. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you believe loyalty still saves lives, and write Amen if your heart is ready for this journey. Have you prepared a cup of ginger tea or coffee to join us all the way to the end of this story? Snow lashed across the valley like shattered glass carried on the wind, wrapping the small Montana town of Dillon in a silence so heavy it felt almost sacred. The storm had started at dusk, and by midnight, the streets were buried under thick drifts, the street lamps glowing like faint halos fighting against the darkness. On a road just outside the town, Deputy Mark Lawson, 35 years old, guided his patrol SUV through the storm with a steady but tired hand. Mark had the broad shoulders and taut muscles of a man who had lived most of his adult life under military discipline. His jawline was hard, shadowed by a faint stubble he rarely had time to shave, and his gray-blue eyes were constantly alert, scanning every shadow as if danger lived behind each snowbank. Once, years earlier, he had been a military police officer serving 2 tours overseas. In dusty cities far from home, he had learned the cruel truth that the world often punished the innocent first. That experience left him with an instinct that never slept, a sense of vigilance so sharp it often made him seem distant even to friends and colleagues. People in Dillon described him as quiet, almost cold, but those who had seen him around children or animals knew the truth. Beneath the armor was a man who longed to protect. Tonight, though, protection felt far away. His breath fogged inside the cab, his gloved fingers tightening on the steering wheel as gusts rattled the vehicle. He muttered to himself, "Just another midnight patrol, nothing unusual." But even as he said it, a tension lived at the base of his neck. The storm muffled sound, but he thought he caught something, a faint echo, not quite human, carried on the wind. Mark slowed the SUV. His headlights carved a path through the white curtain, beams flickering against skeletal trees lining the road. At first he thought it was nothing more than the storm playing tricks, but then he saw movement near the fence of an old, abandoned lumberyard. A tall figure staggered in the snow, arms swinging. From a distance, it looked like a drunk man fighting the wind, or perhaps cursing at the storm itself. Mark sighed. Dillon had its fair share of drifters, and storms often drove them to desperation. Still, something about the way the figure moved pricked at his instincts. He parked, engine rumbling low, and stepped out. The cold hit him like a hammer, slicing through the thick navy patrol jacket with the Silver Bow County badge on the chest. Snow stung his cheeks, settling in his short brown hair. He adjusted the flashlight in his left hand, while the other rested on the holster at his hip. "Sir, you need help?" he called, his voice carrying across the storm. The man straightened, turning toward the light. Even through the swirl of snow, Mark could see his face. Travis Miller, 34, a man Dillon knew all too well. Travis was wiry, tall, with the gaunt look of someone who lived more on liquor and anger than food, A week's worth of stubble covered his jaw, and dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. His bomber jacket was stained, ripped at one shoulder, jeans torn, boots crusted with slush. He had once been a long-haul trucker, but after losing his job in a bitter dispute with his employer, he had drifted into the orbit of Victor Kane, a name whispered in Dillon as a shadow of crime. People called Travis reckless, hot-tempered, a man who lived off intimidation. And now, under the harsh beam of Mark's flashlight, he looked less like a drunk and more like a predator caught in the act. Because at his feet, chained against the rusted fence, was a German shepherd female heavy with pregnancy. Her coat, once a proud mix of black and tan, was matted with snow, streaked with dirt and blood. Her belly sagged under the weight of unborn puppies, trembling with every shallow breath. Her ears drooped, her eyes glassy but wide, reflecting fear and exhaustion. Each time Travis's boot lashed out, she staggered, leaving faint crescents of red against the snow. Mark froze for a second. His first thought, misleading, almost foolish, was that maybe this was Travis's own dog and some twisted attempt to discipline it. But the second lash of a steel-toed boot shattered that illusion. This wasn't discipline. It was cruelty, raw and deliberate. Rage boiled through Mark's chest. Memories from dusty roads overseas flashed. The sight of innocents beaten, of children caught in violence they never chose. He shouted, "Sheriff's Department! Step back and drop whatever you've got in your hand!" His voice cut like thunder through the snow. Travis turned, squinting into the light, his lips curling into a sneer. In his right hand he gripped the stock of a sawed-off shotgun, not aimed but swung like a club. His knuckles were wrapped in black leather gloves, and his body swayed with a mixture of fury and calculation. "Cargo doesn't run," he spat, his words slurring with venom. He looked at the chained dog as if she was nothing but property, not a living being. Mark's pulse hammered. He drew his service pistol in one smooth motion, his stance steady despite the icy ground. "Drop it, Travis, now!" For a heartbeat, only the storm spoke. Snow pelted their faces, wind howled through the fence posts, and the dog whimpered, a weak sound almost lost to the night. Travis's dark eyes narrowed. Then, with the slippery cunning of a man used to escaping trouble, he hurled a curse, spun on his heel, and bolted toward the tree line. His wiry figure blurred into the storm, vanishing between skeletal pines. Mark's instinct screamed to chase him, but his gaze snapped back to the dog. She was collapsing, her legs trembling, chain biting into her neck. Her eyes met his for an instant, amber, dimmed with exhaustion, but still holding a flicker of life. That look struck deeper than any bullet. He holstered his weapon, knelt by the fence, and pulled a multi-tool from his belt. The chain was thick, padlocked cruelly around her collar. His fingers, numbed by cold, worked fast, cutting and prying until the metal snapped. The dog sagged forward, pressing weakly against his leg as if her body no longer trusted the ground. Mark whispered, his voice softened. "Easy, girl. I've got you." He slid his arms under her, lifting carefully. Her body was heavier than he expected, trembling ribs pressing against his chest. He could feel the swell of her belly, the fragile thrum of new life still fighting inside. Snow stung his face as he carried her back toward the patrol SUV. But something glinted in the snow by the fence. Mark crouched, shifting the dog gently in his arms, and saw it. A burner cell phone, screen still glowing faintly despite the cold. On the display, a message pulsed. "VK delivery failed. Get it back now." Below it was a file marked K9 inventory. Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't need to open it to know this was bigger than one act of cruelty. This was connected to Victor Kane, Dillon's shadow. The dog whimpered again, drawing his focus. He tucked the phone into his pocket, carried her to the SUV, and laid her carefully across the back seat, covering her with his spare duty jacket. Her breaths came shallow but steady. Mark sat in the driver's seat, staring into the mirror where her amber eyes flickered at him, heavy with pain but shimmering with something else. Trust, fragile but real. Outside, the storm howled louder, covering Travis's tracks, erasing the road behind him. Mark tightened his grip on the wheel. For the first time in years, the war he thought he had left overseas had returned, not in deserts or cities, but in his own frozen hometown. He whispered into the storm, more to himself than anyone else. This isn't just cruelty. This is a message. He started the engine, the SUV's lights cutting through the blizzard, carrying him and the fragile shepherd toward Dillon. The town slept unaware, but Mark knew something had begun tonight that would not end with the storm. And yet, as the SUV moved through the snow, the faintest shadow shifted in the tree line far behind, a silhouette lingering where Travis had fled. Whoever it was stood still, watching the taillights disappear, before slipping silently into the storm. The patrol SUV rumbled into Dillon as the blizzard thickened, snowflakes swirling in frantic spirals against the windshield. Inside the cab, Deputy Mark Lawson kept glancing at the rearview mirror, where the German shepherd lay curled under his spare duty jacket. The dog's shallow breaths fogged the cold glass, her amber eyes fluttering half open before sinking into exhaustion again. Her body trembled with fever and fatigue, but beneath it, Mark could sense a stubborn will to live. He whispered, almost to himself, "You're safe now. You're going to make it," and tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Mark had carried wounded comrades in war zones, but something about carrying this battered dog back to town struck deeper. Perhaps it was the helplessness in her eyes, or perhaps the way her ribs rattled under his touch, reminding him too much of the soldiers who hadn't survived. The SUV pulled into a squat brick building at the far end of Main Street, its wooden sign swaying under the icy wind. Dillon Veterinary Clinic. The yellow glow of lights cut through the night, offering warmth against the storm. Mark jumped out, snow stinging his cheeks, and opened the back door. The German shepherd stirred, whimpering softly, her paws twitching as if caught between instinct and exhaustion. Mark slipped his arms under her again, carrying her inside like a fragile bundle. The door chimed as he pushed through, and from the back emerged Dr. Claire Anderson, 29 years old, petite but strong-armed from years of wrangling large farm animals. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a neat bun, and a pair of green-frame glasses perched on her nose. Her scrubs were hidden beneath a fleece vest embroidered with the clinic's name. Claire's face carried a calm steadiness, the kind of composure that had settled over her since she was a teenager, watching her father's ranch horses die in a brutal winter storm. That tragedy had hardened her, made her patient but unyielding when it came to saving animals others might give up on. Seeing Mark, she dropped the towel in her hand and rushed forward. "What happened?" she asked, her voice firm but not panicked. "Found her chained to a fence near the old lumberyard," Mark said, laying the dog on the steel exam table. "She's pregnant, badly beaten." Claire's hands moved swiftly, adjusting the overhead lamp, slipping on gloves. Her touch was practiced, gentle but clinical, running along the dog's ribs, lifting her ears, checking her gums. "Severe dehydration," bruising across the shoulder, deep abrasions on the neck where the chain dug in. She's late in pregnancy, too late for stress like this. Her pale green eyes flicked to Mark. If you hadn't brought her now, she wouldn't have lasted till morning. The German shepherd whimpered, turning her muzzle slightly toward Mark, as though sensing his presence. He placed a steady hand on her flank. She needs a name. Ah, murmured. Claire glanced at him, surprised, but he said it anyway, the word rising unbidden. Hope. That's what she'll be. Claire's lips curved faintly, a shadow of approval. Then let's give Hope a chance. She turned to the counter, grabbing fluids and a scanner. When she ran the handheld device over the dog's neck, the sharp beep broke the silence. Numbers flashed on the small display. A microchip ID. Claire frowned, then walked briskly to a computer terminal, typing quickly. Within seconds, a record appeared. She froze. This isn't a stray, she whispered. She's registered as part of a federal K-9 program, one that was shut down 6 months ago. There were reports of missing dogs. Mark's jaw tightened. His mind flashed to the burner phone now sitting in his jacket pocket, the file labeled K-9 inventory. His gut confirmed what he didn't want to admit. This wasn't just cruelty, it was trafficking. Before he could speak, the front door opened, cold air rushing in. A young man stepped inside, his boots clumsy on the tile. Officer Jake Turner, 26 years old, was the newest recruit at the Dillon Sheriff's Department. He was lanky, with an angular face still soft at the edges, freckles faint under the harsh clinic light. His brown hair was cropped short, his uniform crisp with creases that hadn't yet softened from real work. Jake had grown up in Dillon, eager to prove himself in the same town where his father had once worn the badge. Though his father's career had ended abruptly in disgrace after a mishandled case, that shadow haunted Jake, driving him to show the world he was nothing like his father. But that eagerness often made him reckless, too quick to judge. Deputy Lawson? Jake asked, brows knitting as he saw the scene. Dispatch said you brought in an injured dog? Not just injured, Mark replied. Beaten and pregnant. He gestured to Hope. This isn't an accident. Jake moved closer, eyeing the bruises on the shepherd. He shook his head, muttering, "This looks bad." But when his gaze landed on Mark, suspicion flickered in his young eyes. You were alone when you found her? Mark bristled. Yeah. Why? Jake hesitated. He pulled out a small notepad, jotting quickly. Just need to file a report. Standard procedure. But his pen moved faster than his eyes, as though he was writing conclusions before listening. Chained, injured, and somehow you show up with her? That's going to raise questions. Mark's temper flared. Are you suggesting I had anything to do with this? Jake swallowed hard, but stood his ground, trying to project authority he didn't fully own. I'm suggesting protocol matters. We can't leave blanks in the story. If this dog is connected to something bigger, I can't just take your word for it. Claire's head snapped up from the table, her green eyes sharp behind her glasses. Turner, this dog was nearly dead. Lawson saved her. If you want protocol, fine. But don't twist facts. Jake shifted uncomfortably but didn't back down. He scribbled more notes, muttering, I'll file what I saw. Then, almost defensively, he added, You know how this department is. If there's even a whisper of mishandling, it's going to land on someone's head. Mark bit back a curse, his hands tightening on the edge of the exam table. He had spent his career proving he was nothing like the corrupt officers he'd seen overseas, and now a rookie was hinting he was part of the same rot. He exhaled slowly, forcing calm. "File your report, but file the truth." Hope shifted on the table, a weak whimper rising from her throat. Claire stroked her head, softening her voice. "Focus on her. That's what matters now." For a moment, the storm outside pressed against the windows, rattling them in their frames. The three humans fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Mark fuming at suspicion, Claire concentrating on the fragile life before her, Jake trying to mask his uncertainty behind his notepad. Then the scanner on Claire's desk beeped again. A new notification blinked across the computer screen. "Registry access restricted. Unauthorized inquiry logged." Claire's brows furrowed. "That's strange. It shouldn't notify anyone just for scanning a chip." Mark felt a chill unrelated to the storm. He remembered the message on the burner phone. Delivery failed. His eyes flicked to the door, half expecting shadows to appear. Jake noticed his tension. "What is it?" Mark didn't answer immediately. His instincts screamed that whoever had chained Hope wouldn't let her go so easily. The storm might cover tracks, but it wouldn't erase intent. He looked back at Hope, then at Claire, and finally at Jake, whose eager eyes now glinted with the dangerous spark of suspicion mixed with ambition. "Lock the doors," Mark said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than the storm outside. Claire obeyed without question. Jake frowned, pen hovering over paper. "Why? What aren't you telling me?" Mark's gaze hardened, the soldier in him rising again. "Because someone might already know she's here." And as if on cue, a faint knock echoed at the clinic's front door, so soft it could have been the storm, or something more. The knock on the clinic's door rattled faintly beneath the roar of the storm, more suggestion than sound, but enough to freeze the three people inside. Deputy Mark Lawson's hand drifted instinctively toward his holster, his body snapping back into the rigid posture of a soldier under fire. Dr. Claire Anderson stiffened near the examination table, one gloved hand still resting on Hope's trembling flank. Officer Jake Turner squinted toward the frosted glass, his notepad forgotten, as the silhouette of someone moved just beyond the reach of the clinic's porch light. Mark motioned for silence, his eyes narrowing. He stepped carefully to the window, angling himself so only part of his face appeared in the glass. The figure outside leaned briefly against the frame, then knocked again, deliberate this time. Mark exhaled, steadied his voice, and called out, "Identify yourself." A muffled reply came through, roughened by the wind. "It's Daniel." Mark's shoulders eased slightly. He knew Daniel Price, 38, a state investigator who had crossed his path during an arms trafficking case 2 years earlier. Daniel was tall, with a square jaw shadowed by a permanent 5 o'clock stubble, his dark hair shot with gray at the temples. A scar angled across his cheekbone, earned during a raid gone wrong when a bullet ricocheted off a car door. He carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but beneath it lived a man scarred by too many betrayals in his line of work. Where Mark was cautious, Daniel was blunt. Where Mark calculated, Daniel gambled. Yet Mark trusted him enough to unlatch the door. The wind surged inside as Daniel stepped through, stamping snow from his boots. His trench coat was crusted white, his leather gloves stiff with frost. He shook himself once, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Hope. His brow furrowed deeply. "So the rumors were true," he muttered. "They've been using the dogs." Mark shut the door behind him, jaw tightening. You know something I don't? Daniel pulled a folder from inside his coat, damp from snow but still intact. He dropped it on Claire's counter, papers spilling slightly. Grainy surveillance images showed kennels, rows of German shepherds with shaved patches on their fur where IVs had once been. Some had hollow, haunted eyes. Daniel's voice lowered. This isn't just about one animal. Months back, my office received tips about a ring using former K9 units to ferry narcotics. They'd lace their fur with residue, stitch compartments into collars, even use them as live carriers. We couldn't prove it. Dogs kept vanishing. Evidence disappeared. But now. He nodded toward Hope. She's the proof walking. Claire's face paled as she stroked Hope's muzzle, whispering, "No wonder she's so scarred." The shepherd shifted weakly, amber eyes flicking open, as though she somehow understood. Jake Turner, trying to mask his nervousness with bravado, spoke up. "If you had this evidence, why hasn't anyone moved on it? Why hasn't Victor Kane been arrested already?" Daniel's eyes cut to him, sharp and tired. Because Kane isn't just some thug. He's been running logistics across Montana for years, smuggling, laundering, bribing. You don't stay in business that long without people in high places covering your tracks. Every time we get close, files disappear, witnesses change their stories, and men like Travis Miller make sure anyone who talks pays a price. The mention of Travis sent a surge of heat through Mark's chest. He remembered the way Travis's boot struck Hope, the lifeless calm in his eyes. So Miller's more than just muscle. Daniel nodded grimly. He's Kane's enforcer, the one who cleans up messes. If he was the one beating that shepherd, it means she was marked for disposal. Someone decided she wasn't useful anymore. The room fell into silence except for the hiss of the storm against the windows. Mark's thoughts churned. Hope wasn't just an abused animal. She was evidence of a network big enough to rot the town from the inside. But then Jake spoke, his voice edged with suspicion. "You're making a lot of leaps here, Deputy. You say you found her alone. You say Travis ran. And now, conveniently, there's a link to Kane? That's a heavy accusation without hard proof." Mark's patience snapped. "I don't have time for your ego games, Turner. You want proof? Look at her scars. Look at the chip. Look at the file Daniel just risked his neck to bring." Jake stiffened, his freckles stark against flushed cheeks. "All I'm saying is if the sheriff's office finds inconsistencies, it'll be your badge, not mine. I'm not taking the fall for sloppy work." Daniel cut in, voice cold. "Kid, sometimes the truth doesn't fit neatly into a form. If you care more about your notepad than that dog bleeding on the table, you're in the wrong job." Claire stepped between them, her calm voice slicing through the tension. "Enough. While you argue, she's fighting for her life. Help me or leave." Her authority silenced the men. Mark leaned against the counter, running a hand over his stubble, forcing himself to breathe. For a moment, he thought of his days overseas, of watching bureaucrats twist reports while men bled in the sand. The same sickness had followed him home, just dressed in snow and neon signs. As Claire worked, flushing wounds, setting up a saline drip, Daniel stepped closer to Mark, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. Kane's reach is long. If this dog's chip pinged their system, they'll know she's here. They'll move fast to cover their tracks. You need to prepare for blowback." Mark glanced at Jake, who was still scribbling nervously, then back to Daniel. "You think they'll come after her?" Daniel's eyes were bleak. "I think they'll come after anyone standing in the way." Before Mark could reply, the clinic's landline rang, a shrill, jarring sound that made Hope whimper softly. Claire hesitated, then picked up. On the other end, a distorted male voice growled, "You've got something that belongs to us. Let it go, or the deputy loses more than his job." The line went dead. Mark's jaw clenched so hard it ached. "They know." Daniel swore under his breath. Jake looked from one man to the other, his bravado cracking. What does that mean?" It meant the shadows had moved closer, and when the storm outside finally broke, Dillon would no longer be the same. The storm had not yet passed, but within the sheriff's modest office building, a different storm raged. Deputy Mark Lawson sat stiffly in the chair of his own small living room, a place that felt more like a cell tonight. His badge and sidearm had been confiscated, his commanding officer citing pending internal review. The accusations stung: falsified reports, mishandling evidence, withholding critical details. He had expected enemies outside Dillon, not within his own department. The hardest part was knowing the order came from above, someone pulling strings to keep him quiet. With his patrol rights suspended, he could only wait and stew in frustration. Meanwhile, across town, the Dillon Veterinary Clinic glowed faintly against the snow-slick streets. Inside, Dr. Claire Anderson worked tirelessly over Hope, adjusting IV drips and checking vital signs. Her auburn hair had fallen loose from its bun, strands clinging to her pale cheeks, damp with sweat. She was exhausted but unshaken. Next to her, Officer Jake Turner paced nervously, his notebook clutched tight but unused. His freckled face betrayed his youth, his dark eyes darting toward the door every time the wind shifted. Despite his bravado, fear laced his movements. "Do you think Lawson really—" he began, but his words trailed when Claire shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. Before she could reply, the sound of shattering glass erupted from the rear of the clinic. Both spun around as a shadowy figure climbed through the broken pane, followed by another. Travis Miller emerged first, his wiry frame hunched, bomber jacket torn, but his snake tattoo visible above the collar. His eyes glistened with manic determination. Behind him followed two men. One was short and thick-set, his bald head gleaming under the clinic lights, a jagged scar splitting his brow. This was Roy Denton, mid-40s, a former oil rig worker who had fallen into Kane's payroll after an accident left him crippled in one leg, walking with a heavy limp. His bitterness festered into cruelty, and now he moved with a crowbar gripped tightly. The second man was younger, tall and lanky, his blonde hair sticking out from under a knit cap, his face dotted with acne scars. Known only as Kyle, barely 23, he carried himself with jittery energy, like a stray mutt eager to impress his alpha. Claire instinctively placed herself between Hope and the intruders. Her voice trembled but stayed steady. "You can't take her. She's under medical care." Travis sneered, his steel-toed boot grinding shards of glass beneath him. "That dog isn't yours. She's property. Kane wants her back, and Kane always gets what he wants." His voice was low, venomous. Jake fumbled for his radio, but Kyle lunged, knocking it from his hand. The device clattered under the table, dead in an instant. "Don't try to be a hero, rookie," Travis hissed. "You'll get yourself killed." Claire reached for a scalpel on the counter, her heart hammering. She knew it was no match for a crowbar, but it was something. Roy's lip curled into a smirk. "Put that down, sweetheart. We're not here for you. unless you make it ugly. His limp dragged as he moved closer, crowbar raised like a warning. Hope growled weakly, her amber eyes flashing. Her body trembled with effort, but instinct surged. She tried to rise, paws scraping against the table, but Claire pressed her gently back down. "Stay," she whispered, voice thick with desperation. Jake, emboldened by adrenaline, grabbed a stool and swung it clumsily at Kyle. The crash echoed, but Kyle ducked and drove his fist into Jake's ribs. The young officer crumpled with a pained gasp, clutching his side. Travis barked a laugh, advancing toward Hope. At that moment, the front door slammed open. Snow burst in, and with it strode Ethan Brooks, 40 years old, a tall, broad-shouldered journalist with wind-chapped cheeks and eyes hardened by years of chasing dangerous truths. His hair, once sandy blonde, had grayed at the temples, his jawline marked by faint creases from cigarettes and late nights in motel rooms lit by neon. Ethan had once been Mark Lawson's closest friend before a bitter fallout years earlier, when Ethan published a story that exposed corruption within the military police, a story Mark believed painted him guilty by association. They hadn't spoken since. Now Ethan's camera dangled from his neck, its red recording light glowing. His voice was cold, confident. "Smile for the camera, Travis. I've got everything." Travis froze, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Brooks," he snarled, spitting the name like a curse. Ethan lifted the camera higher. The footage played on the small flip-out screen, showing Travis at the lumberyard, boot striking Hope again and again, words slurred with rage. "This is enough to bury you," Ethan said, his tone sharp with conviction. "And if Kane thinks he can hide behind you, he's mistaken." Roy shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Travis. Even Kyle's jittering slowed. The power of proof weighed heavier than any weapon. Travis's sneer faltered, replaced by fury. He lunged forward, but Ethan sidestepped, shoving him back with a shoulder hardened by years of bar fights. Claire seized the moment. She darted forward, scalpel flashing, slashing Kyle's forearm just enough to make him howl and drop his knife. Jake, wheezing but conscious, scrambled for the stool again, this time smashing it across Roy's back. The bald man roared, stumbling with his limp worse than before. "Out!" Travis shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "We'll regroup." He shoved Kyle toward the window. Roy staggered after, clutching his spine. They scrambled into the snowstorm, disappearing into the darkness. The clinic fell silent except for the ragged breathing of those left behind. Claire dropped the scalpel, her hands trembling. Jake leaned against the counter, his face pale, his pride wounded as much as his ribs. Hope whimpered softly, curling against the blanket, her eyes fixed on Ethan as though sensing he had shifted the balance. Ethan lowered his camera, meeting Mark's absence in the room with a heavy sigh. He knew this footage would vindicate the deputy. Yet, as he glanced toward the shattered window, snow swirling in like ghosts, his reporter's instincts gnawed at him. Kane wouldn't let this go. The night was far from over, and outside, somewhere in the darkness, a pair of headlights flickered on, idling too long before slipping silently into the storm. The wind howled like a living beast outside the clinic, rattling every pane of glass and threatening to tear the roof free. Inside, the atmosphere was no less tense, though the sound that filled the cramped recovery room was not the storm, but the labored breathing of hope. The German shepherd's body strained against exhaustion, muscles quivering as she lay on blankets hastily spread across the floor. Claire Anderson crouched beside her, auburn hair falling across her flushed cheeks, whispering encouragement as her gloved hands worked steadily. Mark Lawson had been released from his suspension only hours earlier, vindicated by Ethan Brooks's footage, yet he returned not with triumph but with dread. He dropped his snow-caked jacket on the chair, kneeling close to Hope. Her amber eyes fluttered open briefly, locking onto him, and for a moment, the hardened deputy felt the soldier's instinct fade into something far gentler. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "You're almost there." The first pup emerged slick and trembling, a small cry piercing the air. Claire wrapped it in a towel, her hands gentle but efficient. The second came minutes later, smaller yet equally fragile, its tiny chest rising with stubborn will. By the time the third slipped into the world, the storm outside had reached its peak, as though nature itself bore witness. Ethan, camera still hanging from his neck, recorded none of it. Tonight he wasn't a reporter, but a man quietly humbled. Even Jake Turner, his ribs still sore from the fight, stood silently, freckles pale under the dim light, his usual bluster gone. When the pups nestled against their mother's belly, Hope let out a low sigh, her eyes softening. Mark sat back, exhaling as though he had just walked through fire. "She did it," he whispered. The moment was fragile, but reality intruded quickly. Mark pulled the burner phone from his pocket, the one recovered at the lumberyard. He had been too focused on Hope to dig deep, but now there was no excuse. He powered it up, the glow casting shadows across his face. A file opened easily, labeled K9 Inventory. Rows of numbers scrolled across the screen, each tagged with dates and cryptic codes. His brows furrowed. "These aren't random. They're ID chips." Claire leaned over, eyes narrowing. "You mean like Hope's?" He nodded grimly. "Exactly like hers. These are registry codes. Each line is a dog." His finger scrolled further. Some IDs were marked inactive, others pending transfer. Then one word stopped him cold. "Delivered." Ethan, peering over his shoulder, exhaled slowly. "Delivered where?" The answer came in another file attached. A list of drop points disguised as shipping depots. Coordinates stretched across Montana, some extending to the Canadian border. The reality hit like a blow. Dillon wasn't just facing cruelty. It was sitting atop a smuggling empire. Jake, trying to mask his fear with eagerness, blurted, "If we take this to the sheriff, they'll have to act. We can raid every site." "No," Mark interrupted, his voice sharp. "If Kane has people inside the system, and he does, this will vanish before we blink. We need to act smart." Ethan crossed his arms, his jaw tight beneath graying stubble. "Smart means risking that these dogs keep disappearing. Every day lost, more are moved, more are broken." The tension crackled until Claire broke it softly. "We can't save them all at once, but maybe we can cut off the head. Find Kane's biggest depot, the one he won't risk moving in a storm like this." Mark scrolled again, tracing the data. One coordinate flashed repeatedly, marked high priority. He recognized the site, an abandoned feed mill north of Dillon. He looked up, eyes steady. "That's where we hit first." The decision carried weight. Mark knew his badge had only just been restored. His reputation still fragile. Leading an unsanctioned raid would risk everything. But watching Hope's pups squeak softly against her belly, he knew hesitation wasn't an option. They began to prepare. Claire gathered supplies for Hope and her newborns, ensuring they would be stable if she had to step away. Jake strapped on his duty belt, trying to disguise his limp from the bruised ribs. Ethan loaded spare batteries into his camera, his lips pressed tight in a line of determination. For once, his feud with Mark was silent. The story mattered less than the lives at stake. As Mark secured his sidearm, a knock rattled the clinic door. All eyes turned, tension thick. This time, however, the visitor was not an enemy. Sergeant Paul Grady, mid-50s, entered, his heavy winter patrol coat dusted with snow, steel-gray mustache flecked with ice. Broad-shouldered and lined with decades of service, Grady was a man who had weathered too many Montana winters and too many broken promises. His eyes, dark and calculating, carried the weariness of someone who had seen entire cases buried for political convenience. He removed his gloves slowly, surveying the room, his gaze pausing on Hope and her litter. "You're planning something off the books," he said flatly. No accusation in his tone, only certainty. Mark didn't deny it. "We found where Kane's moving the dogs. If we wait for paperwork, it's gone. We go tonight." Grady's lips twitched under his mustache, almost a grim smile. "I figured you'd say that, which is why I'm here. You're not doing this alone." He pulled a folded map from his coat, spreading it across the counter. Red markings indicated patrol routes, blind spots, and access roads around the abandoned feed mill. "I've been tracking Kane longer than you know, always one step behind. Until now. That mill? He thinks the storm will keep eyes off him. He's wrong." For the first time that night, Mark felt a flicker of relief. "You'll back us?" Grady nodded, though the lines on his face deepened. "But understand this. Once you go down this path, there's no turning back. Kane won't stop. He'll come for you, for the vet, for anyone who stood in his way." Mark glanced at Claire, at Jake, at Ethan. Each held his gaze silent but firm. He turned back to Grady. "We're already in it. We don't back down." The sergeant folded the map, his voice lowering. "Then we move at dawn. The storm will break just enough to give cover. Until then, keep that dog and her pups safe. Kane has eyes everywhere." The room settled into a tense quiet, broken only by the muffled cries of Hope's newborns. Outside, the storm shrieked like an omen, and in the shadows of the feed mill miles away, figures moved, preparing crates, unaware that Dillon's lawmen and one German shepherd mother were about to bring the fight to their door. The dawn broke gray and bitter, the storm receding, but leaving behind a world blanketed in white silence. Mark Lawson stood in the lot outside Dillon's sheriff's office, his breath fogging in the cold as he adjusted the tactical vest strapped over his dark winter patrol jacket. Every buckle, every clip felt heavier than it should. He knew today was not another patrol. It was war. Behind him, the convoy of SUVs idled low, exhaust curling into the frozen air. Inside each vehicle waited men and women ready to gamble their lives against Victor Kane's empire. Claire Anderson emerged from the clinic across the street, bundled in a thick navy parka over her scrubs. Her auburn hair was tucked under a wool cap, but her pale green eyes betrayed sleepless hours. Despite every plea to stay behind with Hope and her newborns, she had insisted on joining. "I'm not just a vet," she told Mark firmly. "If one of your team goes down, you'll need medical hands, not just guns." Mark didn't argue. He knew her resolve was iron. Jake Turner climbed into the front seat of the second SUV, his ribs still sore but his youthful face steeled with determination. The freckles across his cheeks stood out against the bruise along his jawline, a reminder of his clash with Travis's thugs. He gripped his service weapon too tightly, knuckles pale, eager to prove he was more than a rookie. Ethan Brooks leaned against his own truck, camera bag slung across his chest, parka zipped high against the cold. His graying hair poked from under a beanie, his weathered face unreadable. He no longer looked like a man chasing headlines, but like someone ready to bleed for a cause. The red recording light of his camera stayed off. Today, survival outweighed the story. From the lead vehicle stepped Sergeant Paul Grady, his steel-gray mustache frosted with the morning chill. His broad shoulders carried decades of Montana law enforcement, and his presence grounded the younger officers. He held a folded map in one gloved hand, the veins of his age-lined face taut with focus. "We move on the mill quietly," he said. "2 entry teams. Mine from the north, Lawson from the south. No sirens, no lights. If Kane's in there, we box him in. No more slipping through shadows." At his side appeared Agent Sarah Whitfield, a veteran of the Montana State Division of Criminal Investigation. 42, tall and broad-shouldered, her long blonde hair was streaked with gray, tied back in a no-nonsense bun. She wore a black parka over body armor, her blue eyes sharp as winter ice. A thin scar traced her throat, the mark of a knife from an undercover operation years ago. Sarah's voice was calm but firm. "This isn't just another bust. Kane is ruthless, and he knows we're coming. Keep your heads clear, and remember, we're rescuing victims, not just seizing evidence." The team rolled out, tires crunching over ice. As the convoy approached the abandoned feed mill, its corrugated steel walls rose like the ribs of a carcass against the pale horizon. Snow clung to the rusted roof, icicles hanging like daggers. For all its decay, it radiated menace. The windows were black, and the silence around it was suffocating. Mark's team crept toward the southern entrance, rifles low, boots sinking in knee-deep snow. Sarah's unit flanked north, fanning out with quiet precision. Ethan trailed just behind Mark, keeping his camera tucked under his coat, but his eyes everywhere. Claire followed, her medical kit strapped across her back, her breath shallow but steady. The door groaned as Mark pried it open, the darkness inside swallowing them whole. Flashlights cut thin beams through dust and silence. Cages stood empty, doors swinging in the draft, the smell of rust and animal musk hanging heavy. Jake whispered, "Where are they?" His voice cracked in the cavernous space. Mark's stomach dropped. The room was too neat, too staged. He motioned for silence, scanning the rafters. That's when the hiss filled the air. A canister clattered across the floor, then erupted in a plume of choking smoke. Another followed, then another. Panic surged as gray clouds swallowed the team. "Gas masks, now!" Sarah's voice barked over the radio, but the haze thickened faster than they could react. Figures darted in the fog, silhouettes armed with rifles, their outlines jagged under the flashlights. Gunfire cracked, muzzle flashes searing the dark. Chaos erupted. Mark's eyes burned, lungs seared by acrid smoke. He dropped low, crawling toward cover. A gunman loomed through the haze, rifle raised, but a sudden blur intercepted. Hope, her tawny coat streaked with smoke, eyes blazing, lunged at the attacker. She clamped onto his arm, dragging him sideways as his shot went wild into the steel walls. Her growl thundered through the chaos, primal and unyielding. "Hope!" Claire screamed, but her cry was drowned by gunfire. Mark surged forward, tackling the disarmed man, slamming his cuffs on with furious precision. Hope released him, blood streaking her muzzle, and darted back to Mark's side, chest heaving but eyes sharp, unwilling to abandon him. More figures charged through the fog. Grady's booming voice echoed from the north. "Push forward! Take them alive if you can!" Shots rang out as state agents collided with Kane's men. In the chaos, Mark spotted a taller figure near the center of the room, Victor Kane himself. He was late 40s, heavy-set with a square jaw shadowed by dark stubble, dressed in a tailored coat absurdly fine for the warehouse. His black hair was clipped short, and his cold eyes gleamed with venomous calm. Kane raised his pistol, aiming straight at Mark through the smoke. For a split second, Mark thought it was over. But hope moved first, lunging with reckless fury. She struck Kane's arm, forcing the shot wide. The bullet whined off metal, sparks raining down. Mark closed the distance, wrestling Kane to the ground. The man fought like a cornered animal, fists heavy, curses spilling from his lips. But years of military training surged back through Mark. He slammed Kane's hand against the floor, ripping the gun free, and pinned him hard. "Victor Kane," he growled, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You're done." The warehouse erupted with sirens as reinforcements finally arrived. Floodlights pierced the smoke, revealing men on their knees, weapons discarded, state troopers pressing them down. Sarah strode through the haze, her rifle steady, her scar catching the light. "Secure the perimeter, get the medics inside." Mark hauled Kane upright, snapping the cuffs on tight. Kane's face twisted, but he didn't beg. He simply smiled faintly, whispering, "You think this ends with me? You don't know how deep it runs." Hope stood beside Mark, her body trembling, muzzle stained, yet her amber eyes were steady. She had saved him once again. But even as the smoke cleared and the battle quieted, outside the mill, headlights flickered in the storm, vehicles too far to stop, slipping away into the wilderness. The first light of dawn spread across Dillon like a pale ribbon, glinting off the snow that had blanketed the town for days. For the first time in weeks, the storm had lifted, leaving the air crisp and sharp, the kind of morning that made every breath sting with both pain and promise. The courthouse stood at the heart of town, its stone steps swept clean of snow by early risers, its flag snapping in the wind. Inside, benches filled quickly with townspeople bundled in wool coats and scarves, their eyes restless but determined. They had all come to see justice. Mark Lawson stood near the front, his dark winter suit fitting uncomfortably over a body more used to a deputy's uniform. His strong jaw was freshly shaven, but fatigue lingered in his eyes. The events of the warehouse still lived in his muscles, the smoke, the chaos, the near brush with death. Yet here he stood, restored in rank and reputation, though his mind was fixed not on the trial, but on the German shepherd waiting beyond those walls. Victor Kane was led into the courtroom first, his wrists cuffed, his once tailored coat replaced with an orange jumpsuit that seemed to mock his arrogance. At 48, the man still carried himself with the dignity of a commander, his broad frame upright, his dark eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for weakness. His black hair was cropped short, but gray threaded the temples, a reminder that even power could not escape time. He smirked faintly when his gaze landed on Mark, a predator's smirk that promised unfinished business. Behind him shuffled Travis Miller, thinner now, his bomber jacket replaced by prison khaki. At 34, his wiry frame seemed more fragile under fluorescent lights, though his snake tattoo still twisted up his neck like a brand of defiance. His eyes darted nervously around the room, settling on no one, but his jaw clenched whenever the judge's gavel echoed. Judge Helen Crowley presided, a woman in her 60s, silver hair pinned neatly, her stature tall and commanding despite her years. She had lived in Dillon her entire life, once as a teacher, then as a lawyer, now as judge. Her pale skin bore the fine lines of resilience, and her voice carried the steadiness of someone who had weathered storms, both personal and political. "This court will come to order," she said firmly, silencing the murmurs. Claire Anderson sat among the witnesses, wearing a tailored navy coat that did little to hide her exhaustion. The auburn hair that usually fell loose was pinned up, her green eyes softer now, reflecting both relief and lingering worry. Jake Turner occupied the seat beside her, shifting uncomfortably in his pressed uniform. He looked younger than ever, his freckles stark against the stiffness of his collar, but pride flickered in his gaze. Ethan Brooks, meanwhile, sat further back, his ever-present camera resting silently in his lap. His graying beard framed a tired but contented smile. He was no longer chasing a headline. He had already captured a story that had saved lives. The trial stretched through the morning, prosecutors presenting damning evidence. Ethan's footage of Travis beating Hope, the SD card recovered from the warehouse, the testimony of state agents who stormed Kane's operation. Every piece painted a picture too dark to ignore. For once, Dillon's justice system stood firm. By noon, the verdicts came swift and heavy. Victor Kane, guilty on charges of trafficking, abuse, conspiracy. Travis Miller, guilty of assault, cruelty, and aiding criminal enterprise. The courtroom buzzed as the sentences were read. Kane showed no fear, only cold disdain. Travis shook visibly, his defiance cracking under the weight of years behind bars. Outside, the town gathered in the square, not for vengeance but for healing. The newly renovated red brick firehouse gleamed with fresh banners, its tall bay doors open wide to reveal rows of kennels, padded floors, and training equipment. Above the entrance, painted in bold letters, was the sign, Dillon K-9 Rescue Center. Mark, Claire, Jake, and Ethan stood at its front steps. Snow sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun, and behind them, volunteers carried supplies, setting the final touches on what would become a sanctuary. The four of them had spearheaded the effort, pouring every ounce of energy into transforming tragedy into hope. Hope herself padded forward, her tawny coat now sleek and healthy, her scars softened beneath her thick winter fur. At her side stumbled three small pups, ears too big for their heads, tails wagging with clumsy joy. The crowd erupted in applause, some with tears freezing on their cheeks. Mayor Crowley stepped up, her wool coat flaring in the wind, her voice carrying over the gathered townsfolk. Today we honor not just the bravery of our officers and citizens, but the courage of one dog who stood against cruelty. For her loyalty, her resilience, and her spirit, we name Hope an honorary K-9 of Dillon. She clipped a small blue collar around the shepherd's neck, embroidered with silver letters. Hope barked once, the sound clear and proud. Mark crouched beside her, stroking her head, while Claire's hand rested gently on his shoulder. Jake bent down to playfully ruffle one of the pups, his boyish grin returning at last. Ethan lifted his camera, not to exploit, but to preserve the moment. As the crowd cheered, Mark looked out across the town square, at the courthouse behind them and the firehouse before them. For the first time in months, Dillon felt whole. He knew the shadows of Kane's empire still lingered beyond their borders, but here, in this winter morning, light had broken through. And as Hope's puppies yipped and tumbled in the snow, Dillon's people understood. Even in the coldest winters, compassion could build a fire strong enough to warm every heart.